accepting the recording. Thank you. If Kelly, if you can scroll that forward, I'll hit the other housekeeping items. One of those is the audio preference and video preference. So go ahead and hit mute, but throughout the presentation, we will, towards the end of it, have a Q&A session where you can certainly speak up and ask questions. We have the chat box. We would love for you to let us know that you're here today. So plug in your name and the firm or the company you work for. And then throughout the presentation, go ahead and put in questions that you would like us to ask as we get to the end of the presentation. We'll also be throwing in some links throughout the presentation, so keep an eye on that. And then a reminder that today we have qualified for continuing education credits, and so we'll follow up with that. And then after the event, we'll send out a survey. We would love to get your feedback. Let us know how we're doing and how we can improve these programs. All right, so let's go ahead and scroll on to the next page. So just a reminder that later in August on the 16th, we are going to be hosting a social networking event from 4 to 6 o'clock at Brick West. And because you're attending and have registered for this event, we'll send you a link and we'll actually include it in the chat box. But would love to have you join us. It's free to you because you've registered. Otherwise, it's $10 if you know somebody else who wants to join. We have the ability for others to join as well. But with the registration, you'll get a couple of drink tickets and appetizers and just have a great time. So really looking forward to that. So I don't know if Aaron was able to join. I guess I'll ask Kyla or Kelly. Did you let Aaron in? Doesn't look like he is here. So I wanted to take a minute and thank our sponsors, Washington Trust Bank and Witherspoon Brassage McPhee. They're our presenting sponsors for this event. And without them, we wouldn't be able to bring in such a wonderful talent as Dr. James. So with their help, it's been our privilege to be able to offer these two events to our professional advisors. And then I'd like to thank our presenting partners, Coeur d'Alene Estate Planning Council, Spokane Estate Planning Council, the Spokane County Bar Association, and the Inland Northwest Plan Giving Council. Great organizations for us in the world of plan giving. Encourage you to check out their websites, join if you can, and take advantage of these wonderful resources in our market. All right, so without further ado, I want to introduce the main event. So Dr. Russell James is a professor at Texas Tech University in charitable financial planning. And he also teaches charitable gift law at Texas Tech. He's worked as a plan giving fundraiser, an estate planning attorney, a major gifts fundraiser, a college president, and now as a university professor researching charitable giving and fundraising. And we're going to get the benefit of some of that research today. So live from London, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Russell James.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I am looking forward to sharing some results, and we're going to be looking inside the mind of the charitable bequest donor. And when I say that, I do mean, in fact, yes, we're going to be looking at some results from some neuroimaging experiments where people are literally, in some cases, completing their estate planning documents while we've got them in a brain scanner. And we use that to learn a little bit about how these decisions are made related to charitable bequest decisions when someone is going through that estate planning process. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 different research findings. But with each research finding, we're actually going to spend some time talking about the very practical applications of what do we do with that information? How is that useful? How does it affect our client conversations? How does it affect our practice in that area? Now, one of the things, as I mentioned, we're going to be emphasizing is the charitable estate decision, but there's actually a connection between the charitable estate decision and current giving decisions. And that connection relates to the idea of mental accounting. Now, this is a behavioral economics concept that suggests that people treat money differently depending upon what categories it's in, what labels we put on it. One of the things that is very different about a charitable estate gift as compared to most typical charitable decisions is that most typical charitable decisions are choices related to disposable income. People think about their gifts as something that comes from a share of their regular income, whereas when a person commits to a gift in an estate plan, they're actually committing to a share of their wealth, not their disposable income, but a share of their wealth going to charity. And for many people, that can actually transform their wealth as being donation relevant from a mental accounting concept. And that may be one of the reasons why we see in nationally representative data a fairly dramatic transformation that takes place in people's current giving after they add charity to an estate plan. Now, the table you're looking at here, these are the same people on the left in the white bars and on the right in the black bars. It's just that after they have added a charitable component to their estate plan, their annual giving goes up about 77%. And as you can see, that spike is sustained 2, 4, 6, even 8 years later. And it may relate to this idea that a person begins to think of what they can do philanthropically, not just with their disposable income, but actually with their wealth. And so that mindset change can be very powerful. So let's take a look at how the mind actually works to make this charitable estate planning decision. And the first research concept I want to share with you before we get to some of the practical applications is that charitable bequest decision-making emphasizes visualized autobiography brain regions. So one of the things we knew before we started this research is that bequest giving is different. So for example, if we look at folks over age 50 who are regular donors giving over $500 a year, among that group, fewer than 10% have charitable components to their estate plan. So even among substantial donors, this is a relatively rare behavior. So since the behavior is so different, the thought is, well, the thought processes must be different. So yes, indeed, we actually stuck people into a brain scanner here actually at the Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute. And for this first study, we were trying to compare the decision-making process of making a charitable estate planning decision as compared to just a normal charitable giving or volunteering decision. So what I'm going to share with you here is a little bit of what is unique about the charitable estate planning decision. And we're going to take a flight through the brain. So we're starting at the nose and moving all the way to the back of the brain. And we're looking for those colored areas where we get activation, where the brain doesn't actually light up, but it does turn red through blood oxygenation, which is what we can see. And you notice we've gotten through the first half of the brain and there are no areas of significant difference. So all of our rational, mathematical, numbers, calculation parts of the brain, there's no difference. It is in fact not until we get to the back third of the brain and you see the first area there known as the precuneus, and then the very, very back of the brain that we see activation areas that are unique to the charitable estate planning decision as compared with other charitable decisions. For any neuroimagers in the audience, this is actually published peer-reviewed research, and these are the results that we got, but let me translate those for you a bit. These two areas of activation, one is part of the visual system. Now, the visual field information wasn't changing, so this is actually internal visualization that's taking place. And the other area is used whenever we take an outside perspective on ourselves. So when these two areas simultaneously activate, people are engaged in visualized autobiography. We see the same activation in other neuroimaging studies, for example, where older adults are shown photographs from across their life. Both of these areas activated if they were able to vividly relive the scenes in the photos. Otherwise, they didn't activate. And other studies have shown whenever folks are mentally traveling back in time or recalling autobiographical personal events, these areas activate. Now, it turns out you don't actually need a brain scanning machine to find this reality. Dr. Claire Routley, in her dissertation, conducted in-depth interviews with people who had included charity in their estate plans. And her concluding sentence from her study was that when discussing which charities they had chosen to remember, there was a clear link with the life narratives of many respondents. So again, we get this same result that charitable bequest decision-making emphasizes visualized autobiography brain regions. So what do we do with that? Well, one of the things that we can do with that is to understand the power of connecting life stories of living donors with those estate planning gifts that will live beyond them. So in another set of studies, we tested different marketing messages with 11 different groups of folks, about 4,500 people total, and testing 40 different charities. And the way it was set up was we first asked them for these 40 charities, if you were asked in the next 3 months, what's the likelihood you might give money to each particular organization? And then later we would ask them, if you signed a will in the next 3 months, what's the likelihood you might leave a bequest gift to the organization? And it turns out that it doesn't matter what the organization was, people always reported a higher percentage willingness to give to the organization than to leave a bequest gift to the organization. So for several groups, in between after they had said their willingness to make a current gift, but before they reported their willingness to make a bequest gift, we inserted some messages to see what would be effective at increasing people's interest in a bequest gift, but bumping up that interest to reduce this gap. So in other words, if a person likes the charity, we want to see what we can do to make them just as interested in leaving a bequest gift as they were in making a current gift. So we tried lots of different messages. For example, some folks received formal statistical evidence that people agree with the concept of giving. Others were shown national statistics showing that the heirs are going to blow that inheritance in about 18 months anyway. So why not do something charitable with it along the way? And we got some reasonable improvements where people were more willing to make a charitable bequest, but we didn't start getting substantial changes until we started sharing stories. So we began by sharing the brief 75-word stories that were part of the Leave a Legacy campaign about deceased bequest donors and how their life story connected to the gift. And then we took those stories for another set of experiments and we changed them. We changed them from deceased donor stories to living donor stories. And when we changed those stories, it actually made them dramatically more powerful. When we shared examples of what other living people had done in their current estate plans to leave a gift, it had that much more positive effect. Now, I mentioned that we were testing this with regard to 40 large national charities. So you may be interested in which of the 4 different message types worked best for which of the 40 charities. It's actually going to be easy to remember. Living donor stories of what other clients had done in their estate plans outperformed all other messages for all 40 of 40 charities tested. Oddly enough, it didn't even matter if the stories were about people leaving a gift to other causes or other organizations. It was just the idea that this is what other clients do. One of the things we noticed as well in a series of tests is that as we told more stories and shifted those stories from deceased donor stories to living donor stories, the increase in the interest went up. By the way, a couple of things to note about these results. One is that you may note for the 50 and above audience, if they're not receiving any messages, they actually have a larger gap, meaning they're relatively more resistant to the bequest gift. And in fact, we see this from a variety of different studies. But in fact, once they are reading all 7 living donor stories, that actually reverses. And now the older adults are more interested in a charitable estate gift, which suggests that older adults begin more resistant to charitable estate planning, but they are actually more responsive to messages related to charitable estate planning. One of the things to keep in mind as well is when we are communicating, especially when we're communicating at older ages, being able to communicate through story and straightforward words is actually much more effective. One of the reasons why story works better than just spreadsheets, for example, is that as people age, although numerical ability does decline pretty significantly with age, verbal knowledge is much more strongly retained. And so it is a more effective way to communicate with clients when we're simply sharing stories. Now, why are we so interested in how we communicate with clients at older ages? Well, if we are interested in the document that is actually going to control the transfers, then we're interested in documents that tend to be signed at older ages. This is from a national study of will documents in Australia, and it looked at the age of the person signing the will document by the share of total charitable bequest dollars transferred. 76% of the dollars transferred to charity by bequest were transferred by documents signed in the 80s, 90s, and older. And in fact, this age of the document, it tends to be much closer to the end of life for charitable estate plans than for non-charitable estate plans. So for charitable estate planning, it is important to be able to communicate at the oldest ages. Now, that study showed just the final estate planning document. And although we could see that that tended to be signed at the oldest ages, we couldn't see before the final estate planning document. However, in the US, we have a national longitudinal study that tracks older adults year after year after year, all the way until they die, and then tracks where the estate went. And we can actually look back to see of those decedents who transferred dollars to charity at death, at what point did they report that at that point they had no charitable component in their estate plan? And by tracking that, what we see is everything in red represents, either shade of red, represents people who transferred money to charity at death, but who at some point in the last 2 to 5 years of life did not have a charitable component in their estate plan. So again, this suggests a lot of end-of-life fluidity in the charitable estate plan. By the way, one of the other ways that we can use this knowledge about life story being important in the charitable estate planning decision, beyond sharing life stories of other living clients who have made these kinds of gifts, is actually in the way that the gift is phrased. So this shows the different levels of interest that people have in making a charitable bequest gift based upon what we call it. If we call it, if we ask for people's interest in make a bequest gift to charity, we see a relatively low level of interest. And we see this across planned giving. Whenever we use the formal, legal, technical contract terms, it actually dramatically reduces interest in the gift. If, on the other hand, we use more simple language like gift in a will, people become more interested in that. So make a gift to charity in your will has a higher interest. However, if we add on this final phrase, it bumps up interest even more. And in fact, that was true for a number of different planned giving instruments, that if we added on this phrase to the end of it, it increased interest. So instead of asking about interest and make a gift to charity in your will, if we asked about interest and make a gift to charity in your will to support causes that have been important in your life, there is a substantial increase in interest. Now, notice this matches the neuroimaging. The neuroimaging shows as people decide to make a charitable bequest gift, they are engaging in this visualized autobiography life review process. The way that this statement is framed, it's actually triggering that life review process. It makes you think, what causes have been important in my life? And that process, that mental process, is the process that is common when people are making the charitable bequest decision. So that's the first research concept and the first application, to connect life stories of living donors with planned gifts that will live beyond them. The second research finding is that bequests to friends and family engage memory and emotion brain regions more than charitable bequests. Now, for this study, we did a new experiment where we increased the realism of the decision making, and now we switched where we're comparing different types of estate planning decisions. So not just bequest giving versus current giving, but instead we are looking at different kinds of estate decisions. So we let people know at the end of the session, a legally valid last will and testament would be mailed to them at no charge. But to get that, they had to answer the estate planning questions while they're in the brain scanner. Questions about what they wanted to leave to family, to friends, and to charity. So the ultimate result was that bequests to friends and family, as compared to charitable bequests, more heavily involve brain regions of emotion and memory. Now, you might look at that result and say, well, congratulations, Professor James. You can publish that in the Journal of Duh. We kind of knew that's how people thought about these things anyway. But it ended up being fairly important when we started looking at the language that people were using in these in-depth qualitative interviews to describe why they picked the organizations they picked to be in their estate plan. Very often, people would describe gifts that were to a charity, but they were actually for a loved one. Now, this particular study was done in England, where I happen to be at the moment, and so these are some English charities, but you see the explanations. The reason I selected Help the Aged, it was after my mother died, and I just thought she'd been in a care home for probably 3 or 4 years, and I wanted to help the elderly. I also support things like cancer research because people I've known have died. An animal charity as well. I had a couple of cats. I'm sort of a dog person, so I don't really relate to that, but I understand the concept. So the point is that people were engaging in this kind of thinking. So we decided to then do an experiment where we specifically triggered people's thinking about this type of charitable estate gift. And of course, we wanted to do this in the brain scanner to see what would happen when we went through a process where we asked people about making a charitable bequest gift, but then we reminded them of the charitable, of leaving a bequest gift in honor of a family member to a charity. So this was the process. We first asked them about their interest in making a bequest gift to a particular organization or types of organizations. Then we asked about if they had a friend or family member connection to the cause. If so, think about that person's connection to the cause. And then we asked them the bequest question again, but this time we asked them about making a tribute bequest question. And so we're going to look at some neuroimaging results again. And on the left, you're going to see the first time they made the bequest decision. And on this right, you're going to see the second time they made that bequest decision after they had been reminded of friend or family member connections to the cause. And you notice there's a great deal more activation taking place with the tribute bequest decision as compared to the first time they answered that question with the regular bequest decision. So it does appear that the tribute bequest concept allows the charitable decision to sort of plug into all that memory and emotion that's associated with the loved one's decision making. Now, how do we use that? Well, we can ask about family members' life story connections with the cause and also provide tribute bequest opportunities. So now we did this outside the brain scanner with about 4,500 respondents with a similar process where we asked them about their interest in a bequest gift. And then after they've answered that, we asked them about a friend or family member connection, tell us about that person's connection to the cause, and then ask them about a bequest gift. Again, in this case, one honoring that friend or family member. And what we found is that their percentage willingness to make a bequest gift to the organization, the charitable organization, went up dramatically when folks were reminded of that family member connection. And so it was a very powerful reminder. And not only being powerful, it actually could be stacked on top of other messages. So if, for example, let's say people had already read 7 living donor stories about charitable bequests, so their level of interest in a charitable bequest was already fairly high, well, we could still make that much higher by reminding them of a family member connection to the cause and asking about a memorial or tribute gift honoring that family member in the cause. And ultimately what happened is for folks who were reminded of that family member connection, that they were more likely to want to leave a bequest gift than their initial willingness to leave a current gift. Now, we tested this again with regard to 40 large national charities. So you may be interested in whether the tribute bequests work better or worse for different types of organizations. And the answer is it worked well for all of them, but it worked well in different ways. So what that means is that there were some causes that people were very likely to have a family member connection to the cause. So pets, cancer, very likely to have that connection. However, with the causes that had a much lower probability of having a friend or family member connection to the cause, if the person was reminded of that connection, there was actually a very large bump in their interest in making a charitable bequest gift to that organization. So for example, having a friend or family member connection to wild birds charities or AIDS charities was less likely, but if that connection was there, then the interest went up dramatically. By the way, do these memorial or tribute bequests work better or worse for different family members? In fact, they do. What we found in general is that people were more interested in leaving these kinds of gifts to ascendants, and they were not interested in leaving these to friends or to descendants. So the strongest reminder connection that triggered the most willingness to make a charitable bequest gift was a connection with the grandmother. Next was grandfather, grandparents, aunt, uncle, then mother. Father was statistically insignificant. I have a teenage daughter. She often considers my opinions to be statistically insignificant. So some of these results might relate to that. When we look at the best language to use here, again, the simple language works better than our technical terms like bequest. And we found that we tested honor a friend or family member, but after seeing that people actually don't want to do this with friends, just with family members, that in fact honor a family member by making a memorial or a tribute gift to charity in my will, that people had the most interest in that. By the way, if for any nonprofits, this is very easy to implement a reminder of this. If you have a standard response card of you've already included the organization in the estate plan, just add a line that says my gift is in checkbox honor of, checkbox memory of, person and relationship. Because experimentally we found that if you just introduce this as a possibility, it's going to increase the interest in a charitable bequest gift for about 1 out of 4 people automatically. So it's a good way to add that in. The third research concept shifts from neuroimaging to psychology, and that's the idea that the first stage defense to death reminders, such as estate planning, is avoidance. So let's talk about avoidance. Regardless of the terminology or packaging, estate planning is planning for one's own death. It's a strong reminder of the reality of one's own mortality. Well, we actually have an entire field of experimental research that's devoted to this topic of how does it change people's values and preferences when you remind them that they're going to die. I kid you not, it is called terror management theory. And because of that, we have literally hundreds of experimental results showing how it changes people's reactions. For most people, most of the time, they react to personal mortality reminders with some form of avoidance, such as distraction or differentiation or denial, delay, or simply staying away from those reminders, such as departing. Also, humor is an example of a form of avoidance, because if I make a joke, we're no longer seriously talking about the topic. We can also see this in some interesting statistics. For example, what is the most common response to an organ donation request? Is it yes, no, or I don't want to think about it? Well, if we look at these 4 European countries where the average effective consent rate is between 4% and 27%, we would say, well, no, most people don't want to donate their organs. But if we look at these other European countries and where the consent rates are 98, 99% or higher, we would say, well, yes, clearly people do want to donate their organs. Now, before you're trying to figure out the cultural differences between Germany on the left and Austria on the right, I'll let you know the secret. The countries on the left, you check the box to opt in to organ donation. And the countries on the right, you check the box to opt out of organ donation. What we know from this is that people do not want to opt in to organ donation. And just as clearly, people do not want to opt out of organ donation. The consistent explanation is people do not want to think about it. This is a form of avoidance where I don't want to engage with the topic. And indeed, in charitable estate planning and estate planning in general, we see this behavior taking place. The majority of folks over age 50 haven't said no to a charitable estate gift. They just haven't engaged in any estate planning. They have no planning documents. And so we do see that effect as well. In addition, because I don't want to think about it, the default or social norm becomes really powerful because it provides a way out. Now let's look at how powerful that social norm can be when we're talking with clients about estate planning decisions. This was an experiment done with 3,000 people going through their normal estate planning process. And this experiment was conducted in England. Unbeknownst to them, they were randomly assigned to one of 3 groups. The first group got the standard estate planning questions with no reference to charity. 5% of the people included charity in their estate planning documents. The second group got 1 extra question. Would you like to leave any money to charity in your will? We more than double the share of people including charity in their estate plans just by asking the question. Very simply put, people are thinking about a lot of things when they're going through the estate planning process. They're thinking about family members, fights, property, taxes, their own death. It's a lot to take in. And if they're not specifically asked about the charitable gift, it is very possible that they'll simply forget about that charitable gift. So it's very important as advisors that we take the time to ask the question. Now, beyond simply asking the question, we can also see here that if the question is asked with the social norm statement, many of our customers like to leave money to charity in their will. That social norm statement then actually leads to an additional increase in the share of people who are including charity in their estate plans. Now, I mentioned that study was conducted in England, but we also tested this same kind of approach with a US audience and found the same result, that if we add that sentence, Many people like to leave a gift to charity in their will. You get an increase in the share of people who are interested now in making that kind of a gift. So these social norms are very powerful in an estate planning context. Well, since we know that people are engaging in avoidance when it comes to these death-related topics, how do we actually apply that when it comes to estate planning? Well, one application is very simple. If you want to reach a larger audience, communicate estate planning information obliquely, meaning we don't lead with death. So think of it this way. When I was an estate planning attorney, I gave lots of seminars on estate planning. And it didn't bother me at all to give a seminar on estate planning, because when I gave a client seminar on estate planning, I was talking about their death, which is not that uncomfortable. But if you actually are a client attending an estate planning seminar, ooh, that's a little bit different story. Now you've got to be thinking about your own death. And for most people, most of the time, that's a fairly uncomfortable process. So we need to be thinking about the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. If we recognize that these are subconsciously aversive topics, if we want to attract a larger audience, then we can wrap them in other topics to sidestep that initial avoidance response. Now, of course, once the clients are already in the office and we're dealing with estate planning, this is not a relevant factor. But if we want to communicate more broadly and we want to attract that larger audience, this communicating obliquely can be helpful. So, for example, in the oblique seminar, we may not have a seminar simply about charitable estate planning, which is leading with death. We might instead have a seminar on protecting your assets, which can involve current risk management and also estate planning. Or in a charitable context, we can have a seminar on tax smart giving, which would involve current giving tips, giving appreciated assets rather than cash, but also planned giving tips. You know, any of that IRA or 401k money that the kids inherit, they have to pay income taxes on. But any of it that goes to charity, there's no income taxes due. Or if it's a nonprofit, we might be talking about stories from the front lines, but also include the projects and the story of planned giving donors who will continue to fund those projects into the future. We can also do this in the way that as fundraisers, we have conversations about these things. One of my favorite approaches is called the 3S methodology, or the 4S methodology, for 3 stories and shut up. So if I was a fundraiser at Texas Tech and you were an alumnus, it might sound something like this. At some point in the conversation, what comes up is, so what's new at Texas Tech? And I might say, well, we're very excited about our new football coach, really good recruiting going on, a great class coming in, lots of new construction on campus. You know, we're over 40,000 students now. Oh, and Mary Smith did a neat thing. Now, did you know Mary? She graduated 2 years before you. No? Well, Mary signed a new will that one day will endow a permanent scholarship for our financial planning students. And then you take a drink, create some silence, see if you get a reaction. If you have reached somebody at a point in their lives when they're interested in continuing this conversation, you've given them the opportunity to do that. And even if you haven't, notice what you've accomplished. You've shared a living donor story about someone else who made a estate planning gift that reflected their life story, which we've already seen is a very influential message. Also, we can do this obliquely through a donor survey of nonprofits, starting out asking some questions about how they first got connected to the charity and which parts of the charity is most important to them. And then only towards the end, including the death-related question. We see a much higher level of response to these surveys, even if they're brief surveys, as long as they don't lead with the death question, as compared with the standard response cards asking if a person would be interested in estate planning information. Or this story about the charity that put on planned giving seminars. and nobody showed up. So they hired a consultant and said, consultant, what's going on? And the consultant said, I don't know, let's have a focus group. So they got a bunch of donors together around a table, and they asked them for help. We're putting on these planned giving seminars, and we want to talk to people about charitable remainder trusts and charitable gift annuities, and nobody's showing up, and we're not sure what. And then a hand goes up in the back of the room. A charitable remainder or what? Oh, that's where you set aside an asset. You can sell it with no capital gains tax, get an immediate income tax deduction, take payments for life, and anything left over at the end goes to charity. And then describing a gift annuity in response to a question as well. Well, the fun part was this nonprofit got planned gifts the next day from people who had been in the focus group. And so I love the conclusion of the article. Like scientists who discover a cure unexpectedly, we did inadvertently found our answer where we least expected it. The best venue to teach people about planned giving was not a workshop or a seminar on planned giving, but a focus group on why nobody will go to workshops or seminars on planned giving. So again, this oblique communication. In the same way, we think about how is death insurance sold. Of course, we don't call it death insurance, we call it life insurance. But beyond that, most life insurance that's actually sold by a person is not sold by itself. In other words, it's not pure term insurance. It's sold as a combination with other financial and investment products. So I can begin the conversation talking about saving for your kids' college education or your retirement. And only along the way, I might mention, now, if something happens to you, do you still want your kids to go to college? Oh, well, we can put in some protection for that. So again, we can go through this process of beginning with a related topic that's not a death topic. In this particular study, we were asking people what they would be interested in reading about on their favorite charity's website. And notice when we asked about planned giving, only about 4% were interested in reading about that. Whereas when we asked about other ways to give smarter, 20% were interested in reading about that. Now, the surprising thing is when we asked them about if they expected, when they clicked on that button, to get the broad range of all the charitable estate planning and planned giving information across all 12 different types of this information, they were actually more likely to expect that broad range of planned giving information when they clicked on other ways to give smarter as to when they clicked on planned giving. It's just that they didn't want to read about it if you called it planned giving, but they did want to read about it if you called it other ways to give smarter. So perhaps instead of a will brochure, we might have top ways to give smarter, where we include both current giving tips and also estate planning tips. One of the things to keep in mind is that we not only want to introduce the concept in a non-death related context, but we also want to motivate clients to sign the document now in a non-death related context. And here's the basic problem. If I'm not going to die tomorrow, why not deal with all this unpleasantness later? Now we could say you might get hit by a truck tomorrow, but everything we know from experimental psychology says that's not going to be an effective argument. People will engage in avoidance. So instead, we can attach a non-death related negative outcome to putting it off until later. So if you're a nonprofit, maybe our campaign to reach 100 planned gifts and wills and trusts ends in 3 months once you consider joining these others. If you do it later, you get left out of the group. Or if you have a matching grant that'll pay 10% of gifts planned in a will or trust if signed before November 1st, up to $10,000 per donor. You can do it later, but then there's no match. Again, a non-death related motivation. Or, hey, those Section 7520 interest rates went up. If you don't sign that remainder interest deed in the next 30 days, your deduction could drop. Of course, if the rates don't go up, they go down, although not recently, in which case, then there's other instruments that are motivated by getting it done before the rates change. We might also have for nonprofits to invite different groups, a board or a committee, and say, hey, to show a strong leadership commitment to this planned giving push, we want to announce board participation levels at the fall banquet. Can we count you in? Well, we do this. Why? Not because you're going to die, but because this is now a motivation to other people to make these kinds of gifts when you take this leadership role. We can then follow up, really appreciate this commitment, and I check back to see how the planning process is going. So that's the third suggestion, is to, if you want a larger audience, don't lead with death. The final suggestion relates to the second stage defense to death reminders, and that is remembrance by and supporting one's surviving in-group, also known as the pursuit of symbolic immortality. So avoidance doesn't always work. When it doesn't work, people move to the pursuit of symbolic immortality. This is the idea that, yes, I'm going to disappear, but my values, my beliefs, my story, some part of my identity will continue on. It continues on through my influence and support of my in-group. Experimentally, we see that death reminders increase attraction to positive remembrance. People become more interested in fame or naming a star after themselves, or likelihood of describing positive improvements when writing an autobiographical essay. They also increase support for one's in-group and its values, and they increase resistance to the out-groups. This is true across the world, not just an American phenomenon. And we see this in charitable estate planning as well. Among the top 100 UK fundraising charities, the average share of their total gift income coming from legacy gifts is 26.6%. But among that top 100 fundraising charities, there are 17 that are international focused charities. They instead only get 5.9% of their income from legacy fundraising. So this in-group, out-group distinction shows up in charitable estate planning as well. Even if we separate the domestically focused children's charities that get about 23% from bequests versus the international focused children's charities that only get about 7% from bequests. And we see in this experiment, more self-focused individuals tended to increase their ratings of charitable organizations following mortality reminders. So oftentimes people who haven't been donors during life will actually become donors in that estate planning context because it's such a high mortality salience context. So that is the research concept. What do we do with it? Well, very straightforward. We emphasize long-term impact from estate giving. Anything that has permanence becomes very attractive in the estate planning context because of this pursuit of symbolic immortality. Something reflecting the person's life story, their community and values that will live beyond them becomes very attractive. And experimentally, we see this. People have more preference for bequest. When they're asked about their preference between an immediate expenditure for the charity versus establishing a permanent fund, they're more than twice as likely to want to establish that permanent fund with bequest gifts as compared to current gifts. And in fact, even when we were looking at how do we motivate people to make a second gift in memory of a loved one, the most powerful message we tested was a gift goal, a fundraising goal that had a permanence result. So in this case, if total gifts exceed $10,000, the fund will become a perpetual scholarship fund. That more than doubled the average second gift size and increased the likelihood. Permanence is super attractive in a death-related context. This experiment really drives that home. In this case, you had two separate groups that made charitable giving decisions. You had the normal group that was not reminded of their own mortality first. And it turns out that if you describe the charity, this is a poverty relief charity, as meeting the immediate needs of people, that generated a higher level of contribution than describing it as creating lasting improvements that would benefit people in the future. However, for the groups, the two groups that were reminded of their death, their own personal mortality before they made the charitable decision, these results reversed. And now if you talked about the charity as meeting the immediate needs of people, that did not work at all. Instead, for the death reminded group, you needed to talk about the charity as creating lasting improvements that would benefit people in the future. So there is a strong attraction to permanence in this death-related context. We also see that in the charitable decision-making because it tends to be the oldest, largest organizations get the lion's share of these charitable estate gifts, the ones that have the most sense of permanence. This data comes from the UK. They report organizational level data on bequest gifts. Until we get that added to the IRS Form 990, we're completely blind in the US, but we see that in the UK data. So if your organization is newer, if you represent a nonprofit that is newer, consider marketing permanent funds managed by a well-known community foundation. You can borrow the permanence of that community foundation so that a person can feel confident that that fund will continue to fund that cause over an extended period of time. So whether we are looking at a nonprofit, developing permanent giving opportunities for mid-level bequest donors, or we're working with clients in an estate planning context and looking at permanence-related structures, anything that has that sense of permanence, that sense that my identity, my values, my life story, my people will continue on after me, that permanence is going to be very attractive in these estate planning contexts. So we do want to emphasize long-term impact when we are speaking in an estate planning context. Well, that's a whole bunch of research and a few applications in a very short period of time, looking at how people think about charitable giving in an estate planning context. So I want to take a moment to go ahead and stop here. I hope some of this has been of interest. By the way, if you're interested in this sort of thing, feel free and connect with me on LinkedIn. I will send you for free all of my books, slide sets, all my stuff that I've written on this. Happy to share that for free. But I do want to open it up to see if there's any questions or comments, snide remarks, stump the professor, whatever it is that you come up with. Feel free and jump in.
Well, you guys are thinking of your questions. Just a couple of follow-up comments. I think this is great. So a lot of the conversations I have with professional advisors is that they don't know how to start the conversation about charitable giving. And so I think there's some great practical ideas from the presentation today, like asking a client, is there a loved one you would like to honor with a planned gift? I think that's a great leading question that should generate some great interest. And then again, creating that social norm. You know, many of our clients like to leave money to charity in their will. Are there any causes you are passionate about? So I think some real good practical solutions. So are there any questions for Dr. James from the group? Any comments, any follow-up?
And I'll just jump in and say that just the idea of letting your clients know, I help donors give smarter. So if you have charitable interests, let's talk about them because there are smarter ways to give. And that's going to be both current giving, appreciated assets rather than cash, but also giving that has a planned giving component. So just really letting the clients know that you can do that, that ultimately can lead to, very quickly can lead to estate planning decisions, because frankly, if you've got a client who's charitably inclined, and one of the ways that's great to bring it up is just to say, you know, there's 3 places you can leave your money, and that's to family and to charity and to government, and tell me the percentage you want by each one. Well, that's also a client business generation tool, because they're going to put a number next to government that's higher than probably what's in their current plan. And so that creates a reason for the conversation as well. But if they have charitable interests, you want to start with that qualified plan money, because that's going to have income taxes owed on it, regardless of their estate size. So we want to start by using the charity in that way.
I love it. And just again, it's ways to provide more value to your clients. And then, of course, any other deeper conversations about charitable giving, the gift planning team at Innovia is always happy to jump in. Looks like PJ had a question about the rankings and why grandmothers and aunts rated higher than mothers.
Yeah, so the reality is that yeah, grandmothers come out the highest, and I think it's just this idea of the ascendants, wanting to honor our ancestors, to use kind of an old term if you think of it that way. So it was interesting to see that. We do see the gender split where in basically every case, the female version of the family member connection was more influential than the male version. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's driving that. I think the reason people aren't interested in doing this for descendants, you typically just leave them the money. You don't leave something in honor of them. And it may also be honestly that the grandmother was more likely to be deceased, and these are more powerful when we're looking at someone who's deceased.
No. PJ, were you going to add something to that?
No, I was just waiting to see if somebody could stump the professor like Diane Keepy did on the last seminar. And I think maybe Jeff Feuerstein's coming up with something. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's a rare
so
thing.
So Jeff was asking, what are some of the best ways to frame such questions to keep it from coming across, without pressure to the clients, right? It's not, you don't
Yeah.
want to create a hard sell.
Yeah, no. What I think in all of these contexts is the best approach is just share stories of what other people have done. Some people like to do this. Some people have done that. Are any of these of interest to you? Really just sharing stories, because we're not, we don't need to be in the hard selling business or anything like that. But I think that it really helps people visualize when you can share stories of what others have done. And those others don't have to be your clients. They can be what other people have done in a charitable estate planning context. And when we share those stories, obviously we need to start with clients who have charitable interests, right? If they're not philanthropically inclined, then once we've established that, so if they put a big 0 next to charity in their estate plan, then we don't have to look at all of these different super powerful instruments, because they're only powerful if you have philanthropic goals, right? They're not going to be helpful otherwise. So once we have established that they do have philanthropic goals, then we can start to just share stories. Here's what some other people have done, and I think that is a way that's very helpful for the client. But it's not it's not any kind of a high pressure or you should do this or anything like that. So I do like the sharing stories approach.
Yeah. And a great reminder by PJ that you can always use Novius stories, and we have plenty of them. And PJ has a Rolodex of stories if you need more. We will send out the PowerPoint that Dr. James used today. We'll share that out. So if you saw something in there and you were taking notes and you want to go back to it, you'll have the opportunity to do that. And then, of course, we recorded today as well if you have questions or want to go back and watch it again. So in respect of everybody's time, we're at the top of the hour. So we appreciate you joining us for this event. And again, we hope you can join us in August at our networking social at Brick West Brewing. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. James, another great presentation. And we look forward to seeing everybody later this summer.